The power of international financial institutions is ravaging the lives of poor women across the South. As states are restructured and political processes appropriated to meet the demands of global financial and trade institutions, the needs of people, especially the poor, most of whom are women, are being jettisoned. The state and governance have been made cogs in the well-oiled machinery of the market juggernaut. A World Bank report published in 1993 triggered a discourse on governance and led to the imposition of political conditionalities in international lending. These conditions required governments to restructure themselves and function like private companies.
Globalization has resulted in new forms of managerialism and the marketization of governance. What this has meant is that it has eroded the objectives of national development and of the attainment of social justice and gender justice.
The international debate on the good governance has actually been reduced or limited to a debate of what kind of government is needed for an efficient global market. This is now a situation of what Dawn calls the marketization of governance.
For in reality, government institutions equate gender equity with providing access and opportunities for women to participate in the production of goods and services that can contribute to the economy's GNP, trade, and dollar reserves.
The neoliberal economic policies peddled by these global and regional financial institutions and governments have been forced upon the third world developing southern, whatever you choose, economies.
Africa has been part of the world for as long as the humanity has existed. And certainly it took a new trend with the Atlantic slave trade. It was the forced participation of Africa in the new emerging economic power of the United States and the Western Hemisphere in general, and also Europe, that led to the enslavement of Africans. And later on, Africa was colonized by the European countries. So whether we wanted it or not, Africa had been part of this global system.
In some parts of the world, and my region is an example of this, they've been persuaded to adopt economic restructuring policies. And there's been just this general consensus that that's the only way to go, and no questioning of it.
There is more privatization. Even basic utilities and services are being privatized. So therefore people have to pay for it, and they're being impacted in a negative way.
Well, I think if we're talking about globalization and the processes that have been unleashed with globalization, one of the first things that strikes us in South Asia particularly is the increasing poverty and the all-pervasive poverty, which is driving people into all kinds of struggles for survival itself.
A preoccupation with efficiency lies behind much of the justification for trade liberalization. The World Trade Organization has emerged as the most powerful of all global institutions, and its power directly undermines the ability of states to determine national policy and protect national interests. The implications for women are particularly worrying.
The decisions that are made by the WTO, for example, have an impact on rural women, the food they produce. When competition comes so close to the village, where you see, for example, rice from some cities, I have seen rice from the United States, in an area, in rural areas, where women produce rice. And because of the more advanced technology and the lower unit cost of production, the competition is simply too tight for the African women. So even areas that women controlled in terms of food production, food distribution, management, and historically they have played a role in that area.
Or the way in which TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property systems, is seriously prejudicial to the control of women, particularly women farmers, but women in general, over their traditional knowledge, their natural resources, their seeds, their products, by these being appropriated and turned into the private property of global corporations.
WTO regulations and requirements reach deeply into local production structures and markets, affecting small and remote producers and taking away meagre livelihoods in the interests of efficiency and the so-called level playing field.
Because of globalization, there has been free trade zone and there have been a lot of relocation of industry, which apparently has created opportunity for women because they are finding our jobs. But they are coming out to the public space in a society which is entrenched with patriarchal views and values and which treats women in a secondary fashion. The status of women has not changed along with the other changes. Therefore, they are left in this public space without any security.
Globalization has resulted in women having greater access to jobs, but the type of work is casual, informal, exploitative, and accompanied by hazardous conditions. Dawn, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, is a network of feminists from the economic South that has been tracking the politics and process of globalization over the past decade. Dawn's concern is with the impacts of the changing economic environment on the role of the state and on its capacity to deliver to poor people, and women in particular. Dawn arrived at a point of regional and global engagement on the theme of political restructuring and social transformation after intense and rigorous debates before and after the World Conference on Women in Beijing and the World Summit on Social Development in Copenhagen. The debates prompted a need for understanding governance within a global context that predetermines international relations alongside the increasing interdependence of national economies.
We actually had to interrogate it in a way that would change the discourse on governance, that would actually present a view of governance and of political and social transformation that was very different from the mainstream debates, because the mainstream debates on these aspects are very male-dominated and very conventional in their approach and thinking.
The post-colonial state of the South has had a limited history of engaging with citizens, and the entry of structural adjustment programs permitted external financial institutions to impose their economic dictates. Global forces have also created conditions that have given rise to the resurgence of fundamentalism. Dawn's research looks at democracy, development, governance, the nature of the state, globalization, and feminist movements.
We also, as Dawn, are beginning to ask how these notions actually shape the lived experiences of poor women.
Analysis shows that gains made through the women's movements are being lost because they are not being translated into real change at the local level.
We see as important within Dawn to examine the nature of the relationships between the women's movement, national liberation movements, and other political formations, and identify what alternative political strategies are being or could be used to promote political restructuring and social transformation.
Dawn is beginning to reframe traditional constructs such as states, issues of sovereignty, political identity, and security through feminist lenses. Traditional cultures and colonial cultures have combined through state and economic institutions to exploit women. Some of the political realities in countries in the South exposed by feminists include limits and threats to democracy, increasing marginalization of women and the poor, increasing militarization, violence of all sorts, including ethnic conflicts, war, and the breakdown of the state.
For South Asia, one of the most critical challenge facing women's movement is how the politics of fundamentalism and ethnic identities are being played out in the region. It was much more simpler before, when women could identify their common interests as women. Today, with all the identity politics coming, you have a tremendous diversity of issues emerging, and you also have the situation of the right-wing organization mobilizing women. So this is a real challenge because the political space is exceedingly contested and the spaces for negotiation are very, very little.
What do you do within authoritarian states when actually the state uses power to repress and to intimidate rather than to negotiate? And if there are crisis tendencies, the tendency is again to repress.
The states will certainly exert more control on social movements because they don't want protests, they don't want unrest because that's disrupting the market, disrupting investors. And we will see more of this happening.
Most nation states' approach to resolving conflicts involves drawing in its military or its repressive arms and going in to settle a conflict situation by repressive means.
Los problemas de las mujeres en América Latina son la pobreza, la marginalidad, la violencia contra la mujer, no solo privada, sino a nivel de las guerras internas en los países.
When there is a war, there are so many setbacks. There's mass destructions of building, institutions, people, and the way that war impacts on women is different from the way the war has impacted on men, because we have a population of more than 25,000 of widows in Sri Lanka at the moment. So that has led to the emergence of female-headed household. They are poor, they are deprived, they are living in refugee camps. I think half the population of Sri Lanka in the north and east is living in refugee camps.
The issue, particularly of Angola, is the issue of gold. Yeah. It's the issue of diamonds. It's not political, it's not ideological, but it's the issue around the resources. But the women and children suffer most. Now this fight is spilled over to Namibia.
The women's movement have always advocated for peaceful resolution of conflict.
We women are known as peacemakers, and give us that role of being decision making and to make things happen in these countries, and these wars will come to an end.
And I think that is a kind illustrative of the way in which women, the women's movement, feminists, view power and using power.
The state continues to pose many problems for women, and these are being compounded by the intrusion of global institutions into the political terrain. At the same time, feminists view the state as the primary provider for development needs and as capable of acting in the interests of the people. In many national contexts, the state has also been a principal means of gaining advances for women, although these have been limited.
In terms of the state, at one level, this whole policies that have accompanied this globalization package of promoting privatization, rolling back the state, that is something which we see is detrimental to people's well-being and of course women in particular. So we oppose that. On the other hand, we also are frustrated, fed up and angry with the way the state has governed, the way the state has functioned, the corruption, the promotion of local political interests, the violence, the criminalization, all of that. So at one level we are trying to defend the state from this attack from the outside. At another level we are fighting the state from inside. So it really puts us on a tightrope.
Creo que avanzamos en temas de género, en una sensibilidad social mayor. Nadie puede decir ahora la igualdad no es importante, aunque reaccionen con burlas, con silencios o con brutalidad. Creo que se avanzó en tener las mujeres ahora un cuarto propio en el Estado y en tener algunas políticas públicas. Es decir, por un lado tenemos las grandes políticas fragmentando a la sociedad, creciendo la brecha social, y por el otro, pequeñas políticas sociales que en cierta forma son un avance, como también un avance son los cambios en las leyes, pero no es suficiente.
In Parliament, particularly because of the ANC's quota, 30% quota for women in their national list since 1994, there has been a high percentage of women. In 1994, it was about 24 point something percent. Now it is standing at 27 point something percent, which is high by international standards. In fact, we come in the first 10 in terms of internationally. And in the region, we come number 3, I think. Now, at a quantitative level, therefore, you've got the representativity of women as a category. It may not be the representation of women's interests, because you can't talk of women's universal interests. But when you look at the women that have gone into Parliament, particularly from the African National Congress, you would actually say that you've got a wide range of women in terms of class, race, ethnic groupings, religion, region. So they would, to some extent, have an understanding of the issues or the interests of the women from their own communities. So there is that relative representativity.
What's happening at the local government, and what has this meant in terms of political restructuring and social transformation for women? Remember that India and Bangladesh, Pakistan and all these countries have, except for Sri Lanka, have the most illiterate and the most poor women. And these are the women that are being elected. And how? Because there's reservation, they're catapulted into public life. And it's mostly of course through the men, but there's a slow, very, very slow process of change coming in with all the skepticism one had. And there are 1 million women, of course, proportionate to population it's very little. But it is not a small number to have 1 million women at the village level as leaders.
Although battered by global pressures, the state is not withering away. It is being restructured and marketized. But its character remains patriarchal and elitist. Moreover, its capacity to repress its citizens is undiminished.
Well, over the years, the state in India certainly, and I would say to a large extent all over South Asia, the state has become more and more repressive. Its visibility has been more in terms of interventions to control people's lives, women's lives. One of the results of that is that all over the subcontinent, there are movements which are compelling and engaging with the political institutions, pushing for decentralization of power, devolution of power, and for democratic processes to be institutionalized and for more participatory democracy in a sense. Whereas the move politically is denial of democracy, and I think this is one of the biggest contradictions we are facing.
The masculinity and culture of exclusion that permeates the state has significant impact on the type of space for women's engagement and results in stark contradictions. But the state is not a monolithic organization that cannot be pressurized to change from within.
I would say that one of the key impacts of globalization that we see in South Asia is certainly the fracturing of the nation state as we know it. But for me that's not all a bad thing, because I think there are many things that are wrong with the nation state that could perhaps be put right if there is this process of transformation of the nation state itself. And I think for women, this kind of possibility of transforming the structures of governance and of the state means that you have a space to really also affirm your participation in social processes.
Yo creo que el gran reto identificado en América Latina es cómo podemos profundizar la democracia y lograr la vigencia de los derechos humanos. La clave la encontramos en una sociedad civil fuerte, pero con un liderazgo de las mujeres, o mejor dicho, con una participación equitativa, donde una parte importante del liderazgo en esa gran transformación de la sociedad pueda ser de las mujeres. Allí está la clave de un reto. Nosotras queremos que haya plena vigencia de los derechos humanos, sexuales, reproductivos, de todos nuestros derechos, de los específicos de cada pueblo y de cada diferencia, de los pueblos indígenas. Pero creemos que la clave está en que nuestras democracias no funcionan hoy y que debe fortalecerse a la sociedad civil y una interlocución y un control a los estados.
It's only through decentralization that we'll begin to have the entry points, we'll begin to have the access, and then women can begin to have the voice.
Also the concept of consociational democracy, that is consulting more and more people to arrive at consensus. So those paradigms are emerging in Sri Lanka. To what extent we would say, I mean they are very, very theoretical level at the moment. How are we going to translate that into action is something that history has to tell us. But there are obviously lot of efforts towards this goal.
La reunión de las ONG de América Latina, el foro, en su declaración dice que el siglo XXI será de las mujeres solamente si es el siglo de la democracia. No solo política social y económica, sino cultural, tanto a nivel privado como a nivel público. Solo si tenemos garantías de que los estados, para que se cumplan estos derechos, entonces sí vamos a tener un siglo de las mujeres.
We're able to enshrine, non-sexism and gender equality into the Constitution itself as one of those principles. And thus throughout, if you look, our Constitution, we're able to put in each and every clause. We said we don't need a chapter dealing with women in the Constitution.
The most fundamental rights that we have won is the equality rights that we're able to win in our Constitution. So all these rights, women have been able to claim them. They have been able to achieve so much in our country because our Constitution is very democratic. It is non-racial, it is non-sexist. Even our Bill of Rights, it has an equality clause which supersedes religious rights, which supersedes customary rights. At the end of the day, women are able to fight for their equality through that Constitution.
The state is an actor in its own right, and while it may act independently, its unity should not be exaggerated. The state is masculine, but it is contested terrain, and political power is not so unified or homogeneous that it cannot be dismantled and grappled with. There are cracks in the edifice, spaces in which women can contest.
And if we actually want to impact processes of governance, then we have to participate in them, even as we critique them and even as we try to transform them.
We need to engage in the state by actually strengthening our power base, because only when we have that power outside the state can you engage within the state.
As we seek alternatives in the struggle, we do need to realize that such alternatives will have to be developed and promoted with a coalition, with a broad coalition of progressive forces and organizations that operate outside of the state and outside of the traditional power blocks.
Apart from a small number of academic feminists who theorize about state and power, women have not been involved in analyzing the state with an alternative framework. but ordinary activist women working for social change and gender justice have had to confront the state. Feminists working for social change and gender justice realize that the state must be reconstructed to achieve any meaningful social transformation, and that its role cannot be left to civil society or to the NGO sector. The challenge ahead for the women's movement, together with other social movements, is to reclaim the state and redefine the governance agenda.
There are two very important imperatives that should be put on board discussions. It is what we call the democracy imperative together with the equity imperative. The cultural production of masculine and feminine identities and relations will have to be put at the center of our discussion and debates on democracy and equity. It is only by interrogating and understanding how power inequalities between males and females intersect with the power inequalities between rich and poor economies, between weak and strong states, that we will be able to locate strategic areas for which we can launch actions towards genuine social transformation.
Y finalmente, creo que hay un profundo advocacy para la transformación del poder, ¿sí? De las formas actuales de poder, de manera que pueda haber una inclusión de las mujeres y de otros sectores que hoy están marginados, y que entonces se pueda de esa manera transformar el mundo. Creo que es un tema nuevo y hay una idea de ejercicio pleno de la ciudadanía en cada pueblo, en cada país y también a nivel mundial.
When it comes to transforming the state and the option of challenging the way the state engages with organizations for change, the feminist movement and progressive organizations need to push to the center of debate the issue that there are certain non-negotiables, and these non-negotiables are about the fundamental basic needs of people to survive. What are the needs that should be met within our countries, and what should remain integral to the responsibility of our governments? These are the needs for survival, food security, health care, education, and the right to participate in decision-making that affects every sphere of our life. Work that is humanizing rather than dehumanizing, and the value of one's contribution, no matter where one is located, are important considerations when we challenge the state. We need to challenge the culture that dominates the debates and dominates actions at every level in these processes. Secondly, we need to understand the rules of the game that brings about winners, gainers, and losers. Women in the South and the poorest people in our countries in the South have been the losers in some of the trade-offs that have taken place in the World Trade Organization and in economic systems of governance at a global level. We need to build informed partnership and alliances with people and organizations that can help us to change those rules of the game so that the non-negotiables are protected in every national context, and that the gains for the poorest people and for women are secured within these institutions at a global level.
여의도의 아스팔트 대왕 농사 지어보세.
So we need to actually reverse those institutions and those processes that are anti-democratic, that are discriminatory, and that are anti-human development, and particularly women's development. And this is what challenging the state and transforming the state and state systems really means when we look at women's views and how they articulate with these institutions.